The mirror in the foyer reflected a scene frozen in time, a tableau of polite goodbyes at the end of a long evening. I stood fastening the buttons of my coat, my fingers moving with a sudden clumsiness against the dark wool. My husband had his back to me, sharing a final laugh with Mark, his oldest friend. They were framed by the open doorway, and the cold November air spilled into the house, carrying the clean, sharp scent of damp asphalt and decaying leaves from the lawn. The familiar rhythm of the evening's end was playing out just as it always did, a comfortable ritual of seeing friends out into the night, promising to do it again soon. She was not part of their easy camaraderie. Leah, Mark's wife, sat on the small upholstered bench against the wall, a silent figure in repose amidst the cheerful noise. She was not watching her husband, nor was she looking toward the open door. Her gaze was fixed, unwavering, on me, or rather, not on my face, but on the reflection of my hands in the antique mirror. I could feel the intensity of her focus as a physical weight, a warmth that prickled the skin on the back of my neck. Her stillness was a stark contrast to the casual animation of the two men, a quiet, concentrated energy that seemed to pull the light in the hallway toward her. My fingers faltered on the last button. The easy chatter of my husband and Mark faded into a dull, distant hum, the world narrowing to the silvered glass and the woman watching my reflection within it. The seconds stretched, pulling taut with an unspoken tension. It was a stare that went on for far too long, transgressing the invisible boundaries of polite social interaction. It was no longer a glance, but a study, an intense and unsettling examination of the simple, mundane act of my hands securing my coat. I felt strangely exposed, as if the fine bones and pale skin of my hands were telling her a story I did not know myself. Then she moved. Slowly, with a languid and deliberate grace, she brought the tip of her tongue out to wet her upper lip. It was not a nervous gesture, but one of profound, almost shocking intentionality. In the mirror, her eyes finally lifted from my hands and met mine. There was no smile, no flicker of acknowledgement, only a deep, quiet observation that felt both invasive and intimate. It was a secret shared only with our reflections, a silent, startling message passed across the space of the brightly lit foyer while our husbands remained oblivious just a few feet away. My breath caught in my throat, a small, sharp intake of air against the sudden hammering in my chest. The sudden vacuum of sound caused my husband to turn. His smile faded as he took in the expression on my face, a confusion I could not mask. He followed my gaze to the mirror, and then his eyes shifted to Leah, who still had not looked away from our reflection. Mark stopped talking mid-sentence, a look of mild bewilderment crossing his features as he sensed the abrupt shift in the atmosphere. My husband took a half step toward me, his hand coming to rest on my shoulder in a gesture that was meant to be reassuring, but felt like an anchor, holding me in place under that relentless gaze. As if a switch had been flipped, Leah broke the contact. She lowered her lashes for a brief moment, and when she looked up again, her face was composed, arranged into a placid and polite smile directed at no one in particular. She rose smoothly from the bench, adjusting the silk of her dress over her hips with a practiced, fluid motion. The charged moment was gone, shattered into a million pieces of social normality. The goodbyes that followed were hurried and awkward, a clumsy rush of words to fill the space that had, moments before, been filled with a deafening silence. After the heavy front door clicked shut, I remained standing in the foyer, my husband's hand having fallen away from my shoulder. The air was still cold, and the silence in the house felt vast and hollow. I could still feel the phantom weight of her stare on my skin, an imprint left behind. I walked to the mirror, my own reflection looking back at me with wide, questioning eyes. I searched my own face for an answer, for some clue as to what had just transpired. But all I could see was the afterimage of her dark, unblinking eyes, and the slow, deliberate glide of her tongue across her lip. Later that night, lying in the dark beside the warm, steady breathing of my husband, I was completely cold. The familiar comfort of his presence offered no solace. My mind refused to rest, replaying the scene in the foyer again and again, turning it over like a strange, indecipherable object found on the shore. I tried to dismiss it as a misunderstanding, a trick of the light, an overactive imagination, but I could not shake the feeling that had settled deep within my bones, an unsettling, intoxicating hum that whispered of a door being opened into a room I never knew existed. Weeks passed, and the quiet rhythm of my life resumed its familiar cadence, yet the memory of that night in the foyer remained, a vivid image imprinted on the back of my mind. It was a persistent, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my daily routines, a secret question mark hanging in the air. I found myself replaying the moment in the mirror at odd times, searching the memory for a rational explanation, but finding only the echo of that strange, disquieting thrill. Life with my husband continued in its comfortable, predictable pattern, yet I felt a subtle shift within myself, as if I were now carrying a small, fragile secret that was not entirely my own. We saw them again at a charity auction held in a grand downtown ballroom. The room was a sea of black ties and glittering gowns, a cacophony of hundreds of conversations layered over the smooth sounds of a jazz trio. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the clinking of glasses, a performance of wealth and philanthropy that I had navigated countless times before. I moved through the crowd on my husband's arm, smiling and nodding, playing my part. But a deep and undeniable sense of anticipation had settled in my stomach, a nervous energy that had nothing to do with the event itself. I felt her presence before I saw her, a distinct and uncanny sensation of being watched. It was a familiar feeling now, a prickling on my skin that made the fine hairs on my arm stand on end. The noise of the room seemed to recede, and I felt as though I were standing alone under the focused beam of a spotlight only I could perceive. I scanned the throng of people, my heart beginning a slow, heavy beat against my ribs. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that she was there and that she was looking for me. My eyes found her standing near the long, polished bar at the far end of the room. She wore a dress the color of a midnight sky, a swath of dark silk that clung to her frame like a second skin, leaving her shoulders bare. She was a point of stillness in the swirling motion of the crowd, holding a champagne flute loosely in one hand. She was not engaged in conversation, her attention directed entirely across the room, her gaze finding and locking on to mine with an unnerving precision. It was as if she had been waiting for me to finally look her way. A wave of something akin to panic washed over me, and I turned away quickly, focusing my attention on a nearby conversation about property values. For the next hour, I made a conscious effort to avoid her, anchoring myself to my husband's side and immersing myself in the most mundane of pleasantries. I laughed at jokes I barely heard and offered opinions on topics I cared little about, all while maintaining a heightened awareness of where she was at all times. It was a strange and exhausting dance of avoidance, a denial of the invisible thread that now so clearly connected us across the crowded space. Later, as a waiter moved through the crowd with a tray of fresh champagne, I reached for a glass. Just as my fingers brushed against the cool, slender stem, another hand covered mine, its purpose seemingly to steady the same glass I had chosen. Her fingers were cool against my skin, the touch lasting only a fraction of a second, but it sent a jolt through me that was sharp and electric. I pulled my hand back as if burned, looking up to see her standing there, her expression unreadable, before she simply took a different glass from the tray and moved away without a word. Throughout the rest of the evening, I felt her gaze on me, a constant and unwavering pressure. It followed me as I moved through the room, as I placed a silent bid on a piece of art, as I listened to my husband talk with his colleagues. It was an intimate and isolating act of surveillance, creating a private, charged space that existed only for the two of us, rendering everyone else in the opulent ballroom irrelevant. I felt pinned by her attention, a butterfly under glass, and the feeling was a terrifying and exhilarating mix of vulnerability and significance. As the evening wound down and guests began to retrieve their coats, we stood waiting for our cars near the valet station. While our husbands stood a few paces away, deep in a final, animated conversation, Leah stepped closer to me. The crisp night air was a shock after the warmth of the ballroom. She did not speak. She simply reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of my hair behind my ear, a gesture of casual intimacy that no one else would have noticed. Her fingers, still cool, brushed against the sensitive skin of my temple and lingered for a heart-stopping moment longer than necessary. I was paralyzed, unable to move or breathe. The scent of her perfume, a heady blend of gardenia and something darker, more complex, enveloped me, clouding my senses. The brief touch was a brand, a silent claim that left my skin tingling long after she had dropped her hand and stepped back, a polite and distant smile gracing her lips as our husbands turned back toward us. The world rushed back in, the sounds of the city and the idling car engines, but I remained frozen in the echo of that fleeting, forbidden contact. Back home, in the quiet solitude of my bedroom, I emptied the contents of my small evening bag onto the bed. Amidst the lipstick, keys, and phone, something else fell out, something that did not belong to me. It was a small, velvety cloakroom ticket, folded neatly in half. There was no number printed on it. Instead, written in a delicate, elegant script, was a single bold letter, L. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. This was no accident. It was a message, a deliberate and clandestine token passed from her world into mine. I quickly hid the small piece of cardboard in the back of my jewelry box, tucked away beneath pearls and old memories, a secret that now felt heavy and dangerous and impossibly thrilling. I was the one who manufactured the excuse, a flimsy and transparent lie that felt clumsy and obvious even as I spoke the words into the phone. I told her I thought I had left my cashmere shawl behind at the auction, asking if I might stop by to see if she had perhaps picked it up by mistake. The shawl in question was, of course, hanging safely in my closet, its soft gray wool a silent testament to my deception. I chose a weekday afternoon when I knew both our husbands would be out of the city on a business trip, a coordinated absence that now felt like a sign, a window of opportunity I was compelled to push open. My heart hammered against my ribs as I drove across town, a nervous tremor in my hands that I tried to still on the cool leather of the steering wheel. Her house was a stately brownstone on a quiet, tree-lined street, a picture of domestic tranquility that felt at odds with the illicit purpose of my visit. The silence that greeted me as I walked up the stone steps was profound, broken only by the distant hum of city life. When she opened the door, it was as if she had been waiting just behind it. She was dressed in a simple silk robe the color of deep jade, her hair unbound and falling loosely around her shoulders. Her expression held no surprise, only a calm, knowing look that communicated she had seen straight through my pathetic lie about the shawl from the moment I had uttered it. She did not speak. There was no need for pleasantries or false pretenses. She simply stepped back from the doorway, her gesture a silent invitation into her world. The house smelled of her, that same intoxicating blend of gardenia and spice that had clung to her at the auction, and the scent filled my lungs, a tangible presence in the quiet air. I stepped over the threshold, the heavy door clicking shut behind me with a sound of finality, sealing me inside with her and the unspoken thing that hung between us. She did not lead me to the living room or the kitchen, the expected destinations for a casual visitor. Instead, she turned and moved toward the grand central staircase, her bare feet silent on the dark wood of the steps. I followed, my own shoes making a soft, hesitant sound on the runner. It felt as though I were in a dream, my body moving with a will of its own, drawn along in her silent wake. We ascended to the second floor, the light growing softer, more diffuse, as we moved away from the bright, open space of the foyer below. Her bedroom was awash in the pale, filtered light of a winter afternoon. The sunlight streamed through sheer white curtains, painting the room in soft shades of gray and silver. It was a space of understated elegance, a serene and calming sanctuary. She stopped in the center of the room on a large Persian rug and turned to face me. She simply stood there, watching me with that same intense, unnerving gaze from the mirror. But now there was nothing between us, no glass to separate or distort. I felt pinned in place, my social armor and my flimsy excuse stripped away, leaving me utterly exposed under her silent scrutiny. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, she moved toward me. She did not reach for me or touch me, not at first. Instead, she began to unbutton my coat, her movements fluid and practiced, almost ceremonial. Her fingers brushed against the fabric, never quite making contact with my skin beneath, but I could feel the heat of her proximity. One by one, the buttons came undone, and she pushed the heavy wool from my shoulders, letting it fall into a silent pool at my feet. My jacket followed, and then the delicate buttons of my silk blouse. Her actions were unhurried, each movement precise and intentional. It was not an act of passion, but of unveiling, a slow and reverent disrobing. She seemed to be memorizing the process, her eyes following the path of her hands as they revealed the layers I had so carefully constructed that morning. My breath hitched in my throat, but I remained perfectly still, a willing statue in her private gallery. When my clothes lay in a heap around my ankles, she took a single step back, her gaze sweeping over my body, not with lust, but with the focused, appraising eye of an artist studying a canvas. She did not undress herself. Her role in this strange tableau was that of the observer, the director. She remained wrapped in her jade silk robe, a figure of complete control and authority. She took my hand, her cool fingers wrapping around my wrist, and led me to a large ornate mirror that leaned against one wall, its gilt frame tarnished with age. She positioned me directly in front of it and then stepped behind me, her body close but not touching mine, her presence a warm, solid weight at my back. In the reflection, I saw the stark contrast between us, my naked, pale form, and her, fully clothed, a dark and watchful figure in the background. Her hands came to rest on my shoulders, her touch so light it was barely there. They began a slow, exploratory journey downwards, skimming over my arms, tracing the curve of my waist, the swell of my hips. Her touch was not possessive, but inquisitive, as if she were learning the topography of my body through her fingertips. The sensation was exquisite, a slow-burning fire that started deep within me. She leaned in, her lips brushing against the sensitive skin just below my ear, and a shudder ran through my entire body. I closed my eyes, giving myself over to the pure sensation of the moment. The world dissolved, narrowing to the cool slide of her fingers on my heated skin, the warmth of her breath against my neck, the faint floral scent of her hair, and the mesmerizing sight of our two forms, one revealed and one concealed, entwined in the silver, dreamlike surface of the mirror. Our encounters became a series of stolen moments, fragmented hours carved out of the rigid structure of our lives. We met in the anonymous luxury of downtown hotel rooms with sweeping, indifferent views of the city skyline, or in the hushed, sunlit silence of her house during those empty weekday afternoons. These meetings were my only source of air, a forbidden oxygen I could not live without. Each rendezvous was charged with the electric thrill of transgression, a sharp contrast to the placid, predictable landscape of my marriage and the life everyone assumed I was living. Our intimacy was not conventional. It evolved into a strange and beautiful ritual, a delicate game of light and shadow orchestrated entirely by her. Her desire seemed to be centered not in touch, but in the act of looking. She could lie beside me for what felt like hours, propped up on one elbow on the pristine white sheets of a hotel bed, her body never making contact with mine. Her focus would be absolute, her dark eyes tracing the lines of my body as if committing every curve and hollow to memory, a silent, intense worship that made my skin hum. Under her unwavering gaze, I became a participant in my own unveiling. Following her unspoken direction, my own hands became her instruments. I would trace the line of my collarbone, the curve of my own breast, the dip of my waist, all while her eyes followed the slow, deliberate movement of my fingers. It was a deeply strange and profoundly arousing act of guided self-exploration, a performance for an audience of one. In those moments, I was both the subject and the object, the observer and the observed, inextricably linked with her in a silent, hypnotic dance. She was a master of atmosphere, a curator of our clandestine world. She would light dozens of candles, arranging them meticulously around the room so that their flickering light would cast long, dancing shadows across my skin, transforming the landscape of my body into something dramatic and new. She favored beds draped in dark, heavy silks, fabrics that felt cool and decadent against my skin and made the paleness of my body seem stark and luminous in contrast. Through her eyes, I began to see myself differently, not as a wife or a friend, but as a piece of living art. This transformation was profound. I had spent most of my life feeling unremarkable, blending into the background with a quiet and unassuming presence. But under the intensity of her focus, I began to feel beautiful, even powerful. Her gaze was a mirror that reflected a version of myself I had never known existed, a woman of secret depths and sensual power. This newfound sense of self was intoxicating, a potent drug that I craved with a desperate, all-consuming need. My life outside of our stolen hours became a colorless, muted existence, a waiting room between moments of true, vibrant life. My interactions with my husband, with our friends, felt like a performance, a role I was playing with decreasing conviction. The guilt was a constant companion, a sharp, persistent ache in my chest. Yet, paradoxically, the guilt only heightened the intensity of our affair, adding a layer of poignant, painful beauty to our secret world. It was the salt that made the sweetness of our time together all the more potent. I began to notice the camera. At first, it was just her phone, held discreetly, its lens capturing fleeting moments when I was lost in the sensations she was orchestrating. She would photograph the way the candlelight caught the curve of my hip, or the expression on my face at a moment of particular vulnerability. It was another layer to her observation, a way of possessing and preserving the images she so clearly coveted. Her camera became a third presence in the room, a silent digital witness to our transgressions. I never objected. In fact, I found a strange pleasure in it. The idea of being captured by her lens, of being seen and recorded through her eyes, felt like the ultimate form of intimacy. It was a way of making our ephemeral moments permanent, of creating a secret archive of our shared obsession. To be the subject of her art, the focus of her secret collection, made me feel chosen, special, and inextricably bound to her in a way that transcended the physical. The photographs became more frequent, more deliberate. She would spend time arranging my body, positioning a limb just so, tilting my head toward the light. She was no longer just observing, she was composing, creating specific images with the meticulous eye of a professional. I was her muse, her model, her obsession, and I surrendered to this role completely, giving her whatever image, whatever piece of myself she desired. My entire world had reoriented itself around her gaze. The approval and affection of my husband, the comfortable routines of my life, all of it faded into insignificance when compared to the intoxicating power of being truly seen by her. I was addicted to the reflection of myself I saw in her eyes, and I knew with a terrifying certainty that I would do anything to keep from losing it. Our secret life was a fragile, beautiful construct, and she was its sole architect, and I was its willing, captive centerpiece. A subtle but distinct shift began to occur in the nature of our encounters, a change in the atmosphere that was difficult to pinpoint but impossible to ignore. Her obsession with looking, once a source of intoxicating validation, started to acquire a new and unsettling quality. The reverent artist was slowly being replaced by something else, something colder and more clinical. The intimate space she had so carefully constructed around us began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a laboratory, and I, her willing subject, began to feel the first faint stirrings of unease. The change was most palpable in the small details. During one afternoon in a high-rise hotel room, she left the heavy blackout curtains slightly ajar, a narrow vertical slit that looked out onto the brightly lit glass and steel facade of a neighboring office building. She arranged me on the bed, my body positioned in the precise path of the afternoon sun, my silhouette clearly visible to anyone who might happen to glance out of a window across the way. The acute fear of being seen by a stranger, a faceless observer in the building opposite, mingled with the familiar thrill of her gaze, creating a toxic, dizzying cocktail of shame and arousal that left me trembling. On another occasion, she brought a dress with her, one of her own. It was a simple, elegant sheath of dark green silk, and when she asked me to put it on, I complied without question. The fabric was cool against my skin, imbued with the faint scent of her perfume, and it fit me as if it had been made for my body. But that evening, she did not touch me. She simply sat in a velvet armchair across the room for what felt like hours, her eyes following me as I moved, as I sat, as I stood by the window looking down at the city lights. I was a mannequin brought to life, an actress playing a part in her clothes, and a profound sense of dislocation settled over me. I began to feel like a stand-in, a proxy for someone else. Her desire no longer seemed to be directed at me, but at the image of me, an image she was meticulously curating and controlling. I was a doll in her private playhouse, dressed and posed to suit a narrative that I was not privy to. The feeling of being special, of being uniquely seen, began to curdle into a feeling of being used, of being an object in a game whose rules I did not understand. The power dynamic, once a source of excitement, now felt oppressive and isolating. I tried once to breach the silence, to ask what was happening, what had changed between us, We were in her car, parked on a quiet street after a tense and silent afternoon together. I turned to her, the words forming in my throat. But before I could speak, she simply raised a single finger to my lips, a soft but absolute command for silence. Her eyes, when they met mine, were devoid of the warmth and intensity I had come to crave. They were cool, distant, and utterly unreadable, the eyes of a stranger. The fear that had been a subtle undercurrent now became a palpable presence in our encounters. I realized with a jolt that I knew nothing about her beyond this secret, obsessive world we had built. I did not know her thoughts, her history, or the source of her strange and specific desires. I had given her every part of myself, laid my body and soul bare for her inspection, while she had remained a beautiful, enigmatic Sittiksarf, revealing nothing of herself. I was merely a reflection in the dark mirror of her obsession, and that reflection was beginning to distort into something I no longer recognized. The knowledge that I should end it, that I should walk away from this beautiful and damaging obsession, was a constant, rational voice in the back of my mind, but I was powerless to obey it. The addiction was too deep, the need for her validation too ingrained. The thought of returning to my old life, to the quiet invisibility of my existence before her, was unbearable. I was caught in her web, a willing captive, and even as the fear grew, so too did my desperate need to see her strange and unsettling game through to its conclusion. I had surrendered all control, handing it to her piece by piece with every stolen afternoon, every silent command I obeyed. Our affair had become a perilous journey into unknown territory, and she was the sole navigator. Her destination a complete mystery to me. I no longer knew if I was a lover or a pawn, a muse or a victim. The line between pleasure and fear had blurred into non-existence, and all I could do was hold on, adrift in the currents of her obsession, waiting to see where the tide would finally take me. The dinner party at our house felt like the final act of a play I had been rehearsing for months. The familiar setting of my own home was rendered strange and alien, charged with the unbearable tension of the unspoken. The four of us sat around the dining table, a perfect picture of suburban friendship, the air filled with the easy laughter of our husbands and the clinking of wine glasses. I moved through the motions, serving food and smiling at jokes, my body a well-trained automaton, while my mind screamed in the silent, suffocating space between myself and her. Later, while Mark and my husband were engrossed in a loud and cheerful discussion about sports in the living room, Leah and I cleared the table. The domestic ritual of stacking plates and carrying them to the kitchen felt surreal, a bizarre parody of normalcy. The low hum of the dishwasher was the only sound between us as we moved in the confined space, our bodies carefully avoiding contact. The air was thick with everything that had passed between us, a palpable entity that made it difficult to breathe. As I turned from the sink, my hands dripping with water, she stepped in front of me, blocking my path. She took my right hand in hers, her cool, dry fingers closing around my damp ones. Her touch was firm, insistent. She pressed a small, cold piece of metal into my palm and folded my fingers over it. It was a key. I recognized its shape and weight instantly. It was the key to the bedroom I shared with my husband. Her eyes met mine for a fleeting, intense moment, and in them I saw not passion, but the cool, detached finality of a conductor signaling the end of a symphony. Without a word, she released my hand and turned, walking back into the living room as if nothing had happened. A moment later, I heard her bright, clear laughter join the deeper tones of our husband's, a sound so jarringly normal it felt like a physical blow. I stood frozen in the kitchen, the key a cold, hard secret in my clenched fist. This was it, the culmination of her game, the final, terrifying move. I understood then that this was not about me. and perhaps never had been. I was simply a prop, a crucial piece in the final tableau she intended to create. My feet carried me out of the kitchen and up the stairs, my movements slow and dreamlike. The low murmur of the voices from the living room followed me, a constant reminder of the life I was about to irrevocably shatter. At the top of the stairs, I paused outside our bedroom door. I used the key she had given me, the click of the lock turning in the silence of the hallway, sounding as loud as a gunshot. It was a symbolic act, an unlocking of a final forbidden door, and I was the one turning the key on myself. I left the bedroom door slightly ajar, just as I knew she intended. A narrow, vertical sliver of light from the hallway cut across the darkness of the room, illuminating the edge of the bed. It was a stage, perfectly lit, waiting for its final player. The muted sounds of conversation from downstairs were a distant, irrelevant soundtrack. I shed my clothes, the familiar dress I had worn for the dinner party, letting them fall to the floor in a silken heap. The cool air of the room raised goosebumps on my skin. I lay down on the bed, on my side, the side I had slept on for 20 years next to my husband. The sheets were cool and clean, smelling of the fresh laundry detergent I always used. I arranged my body in a pose of vulnerability, my back to the door, my form bisected by the single sharp line of light from the hall. I was the centerpiece of her final, twisted masterpiece. I closed my eyes and emptied my mind, becoming nothing more than an object waiting to be observed. She entered a few minutes later, her movements as silent as a cat's. I did not need to see her to know she was there. The air in the room shifted, growing heavy with her presence. But she did not come to the bed. She did not touch me. She remained standing in the doorway, a dark silhouette framed against the light of the hall, a position from which she was clearly visible to anyone who might look up from the living room below. And she was not looking at me. Her gaze was directed past me, through the sliver of the open door, down the stairs, to the man she had married.